On the 2021 analysis of corruption trends exposes the extent to which corruption has continued unabated during the first half of this year. The report reveals that the organisation received 1,964 reports on acts of corruption from whistleblowers in both the public and private sectors. Now, reports received by the organisation ranged from extortion and abuse of authority by police, school principals, extorting sexual favours from temporary teachers to safeguard their jobs, as well as COVID-19 related graft. The report says that those who are brave enough to expose corruption continue to face threats to their lives as the South African government is even more hostile to whistleblowers. Corruption Watch researcher Melusi Ncala joins us virtually to discuss this issue. Great to have you. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Good morning, Leon, and good morning to the viewers, and thank you for having us this morning.
Always a pleasure. So from what period to what period of 2021 does this report focus on?
This report, as you've mentioned, is an account of whistleblower cases that we have received, and this is from the period 1 January until the end of June of this year. This is the fifth of the analysis of corruption trends report, or at least the ACT report, as we call it, that we have published.
It's quite amazing that the issues of corruption, they may get worse, but the issues stay the same. I mean, as in your previous reports, there was police corruption continues to dominate this list, topping the reports at 12% this year. And also the lack of protection for whistleblowers, which we will get into, and of course sexual favours by teachers, which is just, it's devastating and continues, and principals as well. What kind of drastic action does South Africa need to get on top of this?
It's hard to say, Leon. I mean, with every edition of the ACT report, at least, we mention quite clearly and unequivocally that there needs to be accountability, and that accountability needs to be from the top. It cannot be that, when we talk about corruption, we only want to use empty platitudes, as seems to be the case, and hence perceptions of corruptions are so high when we talk about corruption. In this particular report, we have actual evidence of people talking about corruption and the impact of that corruption. And as you've mentioned, it's in police. For example, 12% of the cases are about police corruption. A trend that is growing, a hotspot at least, is about COVID-related corruption, and that's at 8%. Schools are at 6%, and public housing is at 4%. So these are very serious issues. These are issues pertaining to socioeconomic rights. And at some point in time, the government needs to stop just using political slogans to say this is how we're going to deal with corruption.
Yeah. What is also baffling about the situation is that the police continue to top the list of corruption. And that is, I think, the root of where our problems lie. And this has been for quite a few consecutive years now. I mean, if the police are the most corrupt in any society, how are we going to stop this?
In fact, look at the type of corruption incidents that we're talking about. And in fact, some of these we explore even further in a podcast that we are releasing with this edition of the report, just to highlight some of these cases to the general public so that they can be your face. So, for example, there's this issue of abuse of authority. That counts for 37% of the cases. Then you have dereliction of duty, 34%, and bribery extortion comes in at 22%. So what we're learning here, at least, is that those who are in authority, who we expect at the very least to care about ordinary citizens, are not. If anything, based on whistleblower accounts, we're learning that they are in cahoots with criminal syndicates, as high as political structures, but also in community structures. They allow drug dealers to operate, and when whistleblowers go to them, they don't pay them any mind or give them any protection or even listen to their grievances.
Yeah. Have you, as Corruption Watch, and I'm sure you have, but I want to know how successful you've been, the Minister of Police, I mean, when we hear these kind of things coming out, what is What is his response? What is the ministry's response? Do they give you time to actually present these reports to you and say, you've got a problem, and do they do anything about it?
At some point in time, the Minister of Police indicated that he wants to have a conversation with us. That hasn't really happened ever since, but we have tried and are in conversation with other structures. We are part of the anti-corruption forum, and we have established that with the police, civilian, and we are in discussion with them, and we do now and again communicate to them the various cases that we receive. But clearly more needs to be done.
Yeah, it certainly does, because I mean, when you detail the report, it says that communities are vulnerable because police officers, according to the report, care more about securing these dodgy dealings and just basically turning to corruption as opposed to anything else, and dealing with these criminal networks. I mean, it's easy to feel sorry for communities, but aren't we, as the people, partly responsible for this sorry state of things and affairs as well?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of easy to point the finger at ordinary people because this is the environment that we find ourselves in. Yes, we do have a moral responsibility. I definitely agree with that argument that we need to be part of the change that we want to see in society, and this is whilst we're dealing with the systemic problem of corruption. So that simply means, in the event when you're asked for a cold drink of 100 Rand or 200 Rand, especially when you've been stopped by a police officer, then you need to make a clear decision. Is this something that you want to do, or you want to go pay the fine? Because the act of corruption is as small as that and is as big as political corruption or grand corruption, as we've come to learn.
Yeah, I mean, I this morning was reading a report again from out of the Daily Maverick, and this is they've been working on this particular story, and it's the one of the digital vibes, and just reading about the corruption that was going on all during the time of the pandemic, and Gucci handbags, Smeg kettles, all of this bought with government money that was meant for communication during a pandemic. And it just goes on. International trips, cameras valued at 90,000 Rand as gifts. I mean, it just is heartbreaking when you look at something like this. Obviously, this is just a report that's not a report. It's an article that has just come out on the Daily Maverick. So, but these are the kind of things that they're happening. But obviously, it comes to light because it's been discovered. But this is something that is happening all the time with money that is meant to do better in South Africa, and yet the acts, in terms of trying to get rid of it and acting on these things, seems to be slower than anything, and nothing ever seems to happen. But from your side, do you feel that government takes these things seriously enough? If they keep on happening, are there enough repercussions?
I think it's encouraging to see perhaps the Special Investigative Unit releasing some of these reports or looking into these matters. The Hawk seems to be showing some intention about looking into corruption issues, but then we never really get to know who's involved, the masterminds behind some of these projects. I mean, we've seen in relation to the murder of Papita Diokran, where we only know about the little people, and I don't mean that to say that what they've done is not bad, but who are the masterminds?
Yeah.
At what point in time do we get to know? Because these are the people, these are the political or corporate figures that are truly behind the criminal and corrupt acts that we see manifesting in society.
Indeed. I mean, the same can be said from the insurrection that we saw. Who are the masterminds? We saw maybe a few people appearing in court and out on bail, but are those the masterminds? And, those are the questions we need to keep asking. The other issue is we're always pointing at government and the public sector, but the private sector, we let them perhaps get away with too much, because the report also highlights huge collision between the public and the private sector.
Yeah, there is. There's always an intersection in terms of how we look at corruption between public sector and private sector, public and private sectors. And this is most pronounced, at least in the health sector, as you've mentioned. We've got a case or two relating to the rollout of vaccines, for example, where whistleblowers implicate political figures, or at least their families, who have been able to get tenders worth hundreds of millions of rands. And of course, then at the local government level, we also have cartel-like structures operating in these communities, companies that have been receiving tenders for decades in some instances, just because they're willing to pay kickbacks to officials.
Just in terms of the prevalence of corruption that's related to the procurement administration for the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, we touched on that a little bit when I was talking about digital vibes and more reports coming out here. When we look at the mismanagement of funds, like the temporary employment relief scheme intended to provide support, there was 8%, followed by corruption in public schools, 6%, and public housing, 4%, as well as the distribution of food parcels also features there. I mean, the question, I suppose, is if we believe that the country's law enforcement agencies like the Hawks and the SIU have cases before them, why are we not seeing massive arrests?
I think that's a question we need to ask the National Prosecuting Authority, Leanne, because if the evidence is there, if the investigations have been completed, then it's now up to our courts. That's where we need to see the action unfolding. That's where we need to see some of these people appearing. But, you know, if we have to go by what whistleblowers are saying, it's they allege that people have political connections and they're protected by political figures. So perhaps that's something that we need to look into a little bit more to figure out how do we actually unravel this and make sure that at least people can be held accountable, because there's a lot of political interference. I'm thinking, for example, one of the cases that we talk about on our podcast relates to the Johannesburg Development Agency, where whistleblower alleges that political figures or persons are involved in the running of the agency. So it just tells you the extent to which political heads interfere with processes, with investigations, and also holding people accountable.
Just finally, as I let you go, I mean, I can't but help that one of the worst parts of this report is the most vulnerable of our societies are our children, and they're being affected and basically being preyed on by principals, teachers, when it comes to sexual abuse and issues like that. And this is something that has been covered in Corruption Watch's survey year after year after year, and it continues unabated. As much as we can talk about adults engaging in this, when you talk about children who are dropped at school and you hope that they're under the protection of of teachers or principals, and that is where they're being, predated on. This is a huge issue.
Yeah, it's a huge issue, and we'll keep on actually writing about this for as long as we receive whistleblower accounts. And this is what we have termed sextortion, or at least in anti-corruption work, we talk about sextortion when a person in authority solicits sexual favors. And this happens either when a principal promises a learner or a student to say that they will give them higher marks or give them favors, or even blackmail them emotionally and otherwise to say that they want sexual favors. But it's so widespread that it's even with amongst staff members, where people are trying to keep their employment, where principals and school governing body members are threatening staff members to say, if you don't sleep with me, I'm not going to renew your contract, or I'm going to ensure that you get fired. So it's widespread, it's a problem, and something needs to get done about it.
All right, Melusi, let's leave it there for this morning. Thanks so much for talking to us. Corruption Watch, I suppose, bringing out that report focusing on the 2021 analysis of corruption trends. The report showing corruption in South Africa continues undeterred. And the biggest offenders are the country's police officers. Scary, Sakina. Really, really scared.